All right, good evening, everyone. Very good to have all of you tonight as we begin this special series of lessons on shepherding and leadership, and we're grateful that you've chosen to come and be with us tonight. I'll say a little bit more about tomorrow's activity and, of course, on Sunday as well as we move forward. But we're glad to have you tonight. Russ LeGrone and Marty Broadwell are with us. This is a series of lessons that they've done in several places, and some of you have heard these lessons, or at least parts of these lessons, I'm sure, at other places. And so I told these guys that's why you were here, because you liked them so much. And one of them said maybe they just want to see if we can get it right. But anyway, we're very, very glad to have these men. Both of these men have served as elders for several years. Russ is still serving as an elder, but Marty and Russ worship and serve the Embry Hills Church in the Atlanta area. And again, they've done these lessons, and I have benefited as a result of their teaching for many years. We've had Marty for 3 of our Saturday in the Word, Men's Saturday in the Word. So you ladies have never probably seen Marty. He's not much to look at, but you know, at least he's here. But we're very, very glad to have him back, and of course, glad to have Russ with us this first time. But we're not going to sing tonight. This is strictly to hear what they have to say from the Word of God. So we'll begin in just a moment. Russ is going to speak, then we're going to take about a 5-minute break, and then Marty will speak for us as well tonight. So before Russ comes, let's go to God in prayer, please. Father, for the day you've given us and for each blessing, we're thankful. We're thankful for your continued protection over us and sustenance for us. We pray tonight that you be with these men as they present their lessons to us, and we pray that we might benefit greatly from what they do. Again, bless us in every way. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, I can tell you it's a pleasure to be here. As Kenny said, we have had the opportunity to do this in several different places over the years. And so as I stand before you, you may have no idea what to expect in this, but I do. And one of the things that I know will take place over the course of the weekend is that I'm going to be challenged to be a better elder. I'm going to learn some things. I'm going to go back home. I'm going to have my focus kind of rebuilt again. I always gain a great deal from these studies, and I'm grateful that we're able to be here. And both of us are very honored to do this. I'm going to put in front of you really right away what 4 goals that we hope to accomplish across these lessons. And you can be the judge by the time we finish this on Sunday afternoon as to whether or not we've accomplished any of these goals. But this is why we've come, what we're going to try to do. The first thing is that I like to help to build a deeper appreciation of God's plan for elders. Why is this such a wise plan? How does God expect for it to work? And we don't oftentimes devote, certainly not a whole weekend, to a study about elders, but frequently we don't spend any time at all studying through, thinking through these things. And so here's an opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of what God's plan really is. And in order to do that, I think it's important also to give you an awareness of what elders actually do. A little bit of the behind the scenes, the practical day-to-day work in the life of an elder. You may know, I don't know how often the elders here meet. You probably have some idea of there's an elders meeting going on, and maybe you wonder what's happening during that elders meeting. Well, that's a little bit of the aspect of what we'll bring out across this. There's a lot more of work that elders do on a one-to-one basis with members, and we want to talk about some of those things and help you have a better appreciation of the work that elders are doing and should be doing. The third thing, though, is to motivate other men to be ready to serve. You've got 4 elders here, and you may feel like you're in good stead with those 4, but life, the things that happen in life, we don't know what the future holds. We do know that eventually you're going to need other men to step up and to serve as elders. I'm going to tell you something about Marty in a minute that will help to illustrate why we think it's so important for there to be another group of men who are ready to step in when something happens to elders. But if you are a younger man here, active, serving, we'd like to put into your mind, into your vision, this idea of becoming one day an elder. And we think some of the things we'll talk about, particularly tomorrow, would help toward motivating you to work harder toward that end. And then finally this, both of us believe that the heart of an elder's work is the work that elders do with individuals, and especially with the weaker members. And I would say that that focus that elders have on those that are weak, that are struggling perhaps in their ability to follow after Christ, is really meant to be a concern that every member should have. It's wonderful to have stronger members around us that are helping to hold us up and hold us accountable and move us along. But around us are those that are perhaps struggling to even make it day by day and to be faithful to the Lord. They should be in our hearts and concerns for every one of us, but that's especially, we believe, the focus of an elder's work. And we'll talk about that more and more as we go through this. I'll give you a roadmap to what we're going to do. Here we are on Friday night, and my task is to talk about understanding what the role of an elder does. So we're going to go through a number of different things there in a few minutes, but I'm going to pause and just leave that hanging, because I want to tell you that in order to accomplish those goals, we've really got two different approaches in this. The first approach should be pretty obvious, and it's really kind of what's hanging on this title here. We're going to dig into God's Word and dig as deeply as we can and try to at least get exposed quickly to a lot of passages tonight. They're going to talk about who elders are, what they do, what the importance of their work is. So we'll dig into that in a few minutes. Another approach, though, is we'd like to offer to you some of the experience that both of us have had, not just serving as elders, but also the fact that we've been part of a congregation that for the last 40 years continuously has had elders. We've been a part of that. So we've also, as we've grown up and raised our families and all, we've had the benefit of working with elders, following them, listening to them, being guided by them, and the things that they provided for us. And I think both of those experiences, serving as elders and also following those elders, are things that we can offer along the way, and I hope you find that beneficial as well. So I'll tell you just a little bit about the two of us before we then begin to get into some of these scriptures in this. My wife Kay and I went to Atlanta immediately after we finished college. I usually just say college, but since I am here in my home state, we went to the University of Alabama, and that's where we met. And after we were done, the two of us moved to Atlanta in 1984 and found the Embry Hills Church there, which is where we began to worship, and we've been there ever since. We thought we were going to be there for 2 or 3 years, but we've never left. I've served as an elder in that church now for 18 years. And Marty and his wife, Mary, had moved there the year before us. Marty had grown up in Atlanta and at that church, but had been away in other places, and they moved back. Marty served as an elder for about 12 years until Mary, his wife, passed away a little over 11 years, almost 12 years ago now. And after Mary's death, Marty, in his conscience, felt that he should resign as an elder. And so he's no longer an elder, but he's got all that experience and wisdom that he gained throughout all of that. But it was a pretty traumatic thing for us as a church, losing Marty as an elder. It's another one of those reasons why I think it's so important to be thinking about that next generation and people being ready to step in, because we don't know all of those things that will happen along the way. I should also add, you'll figure this out, it's obvious that we're not preachers, although some of you have heard Marty before, so you know what a fine teacher that he is. You don't know me at all. But neither one of us had served as preachers along the way. We had full-time jobs. And until the last couple of years, both of us were pretty intensely involved in our careers, even when we were serving as elders, which is the most frequent way that it happens. That elders are doing other things as well as they're trying to carry out this important work that the Lord has. It's a little bit better now. We don't have to rush off on Sunday evening to get back to our jobs on Monday morning. But that was the life for a very long time. And finally, just a couple of words about Embry Hills, so you know about the church where we are. If if we've both been members there for 40 years, I think you understand that our perspective of being elders and what elders are like, it's kind of a little narrow viewpoint of that one place, right? Because that's really been our experience, although we've been fortunate to go out to a lot of other churches and meet people and know a few other things. Embry Hills is a fairly large group. Our attendance oftentimes will go over 450 on Sunday mornings. It's a diverse group. It's racially much more diverse than most churches are. We also have a large group that Spanish is their primary language. And we've worked very hard the last few years to find a way for those members to be able to worship and hear their primary language throughout most of the worship and be able to participate with us as one church. That's been a challenge along the way. There's also a diverse group in terms of economics. We have members who really are dependent on substance from the government and things to make a living, and others that are incredibly wealthy. But it's kind of that maturity, spiritual maturity level that's so diverse. You know, those that are just now trying to figure out what the books of the Bible are, and then others that just seem to me to be almost biblical scholars in the things that they know. What makes that group, that may sound different, some ways similar here, some ways different, but what makes it the same, I believe, are the struggles that individuals have to follow the Lord. And you know what those are like. Among the group here, I have no doubt there are those that are struggling with their spiritual immaturity, with viewpoints of worldliness. You know, the possessions they have in life are much more important to them. Their status is more important to them than it should be. There undoubtedly are struggles within marriages among this group. There are those who maybe have some substance abuse issues that may or may not be known to others. And even just the difficulties we face with the trials of life, you know, the things that happen, the sicknesses within our families, the other disappointments that happen in life that then have an effect on us spiritually and kind of pull us away from God. Who's there to help them? And those issues are going to be the same, I think, no matter where you go in any church. And it's the reason why elders are so valuable and so important is because they help to step in and to address those kinds of things. Wherever there are people trying to make Christ the center of their life in a broken world, there are going to be these kinds of issues. So I actually started this a little premature, showing you a little bit of a roadmap. Here's where we're going to go. So I'm going to talk, in a few minutes, we're going to begin to talk about some passages and things that mention elders. But Marty then is going to talk about elders as shepherd of the flock. And I'll get to a point, I'll try to tell you a little bit of the difference of what we mean by shepherd of sheep and the shepherds of the flock. We'll come back to that, but Marty's focus tonight will be on addressing the idea of elders as the shepherds of the flock. Tomorrow, we're going to have a workshop with the men. I believe it's going to start at 9 o'clock. I put that up there. We've got at least 3 things that we would like to focus on in that. We're going to talk about the nature of the work, and you'll see there's a number 1 there that matches the one I have on my lesson here. We're going to go back through some of the things we'll talk about tonight and elaborate it with that group. And then we're going to talk about sheep shepherding, which is, you'll hear us say that. We think that's the heart of the work, this individual sheep that elders work with. We're going to talk about that in the workshop, and then we're going to talk to the men about developing. How can they, in their families, in their current service, be developing themselves along the way so that one day perhaps they're ready, they're prepared more than they would have been to serve as elders. And on Sunday, Marty has a lesson. He has a sermon he's going to preach to you about elders as shepherds of the sheep, particularly from the perspective of the sheep. What should they want out of their elders? What should they expect, and what would they benefit from if they were to look to those elders to help them? And then at the end, I've got a lesson in your Bible class about Paul and the elders there at Ephesus, and we're going to kind of use that as a way of tying everything together. At the end, we'll see how well that goes. That's a more recent thing that I've begun to teach on in doing that. All right. So the reason I'm down here on the floor, and you'll see, I think, even more with Marty, is we'd like to conduct this somewhat like a class. And you're going to hear me do most of the talking, but I got a question or two for you. And one of those is, if I were to ask you quickly. We're gonna talk about elders tonight. What's the first passage that comes into your mind? Don't put much thought to it. Just what's a passage that almost immediately comes into mind if we're going to talk about elders? What do you have? I want several different answers. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Titus 1. Thank you. I know there's always somebody who's going to be willing to step forward and be the first one to speak. I'm very grateful for that. And for the fact that he answered the answer that I was hoping somebody would say, which is Titus 1. What else comes to mind, perhaps?
Acts 14.
All right, Acts 14. Okay, this is going to be good. Somebody actually is going in a direction I don't always expect to hear, but that'll be helpful. Titus 1, I expect. What else? What are some other passages that you just immediately think, okay, yeah, elders, what about? All right, 1 Timothy chapter 3. You know, we had Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3. What do they have in common, by the way? What are those two chapters about? It's about the qualification of elders. If you've come to this weekend study tonight and plan on coming back because you're hoping to learn a lot about the qualifications of elders, you're going to be really disappointed in the two of us because we're pretty much not going to talk about that. Because there's a lot more to be learned. There's a lot of other passages that talk about what elders do, not just who should be elders. And sometimes we get caught up in spending so much time talking and working through who's qualified and who's not, who should be an elder, we don't get to a real understanding of what they do. Any other passages that come to mind? You've kind of already helped to make my point that Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3 come up most frequently, but Mitch, you got one? All right, Hebrews 13 and verse 17 in particular we're going to look at tonight. Verse 7 I think is also a reference perhaps to those men as well. So that's an important passage, and I think you're going to be surprised at just how many verses that there are. And so let's just kind of take a quick look across the scriptures. We'll come back to a few of those in the discussion that I want to have. Here we go. Elders, God's plan. Let's start first of all with the book of Acts and just kind of thumb through it. The first reference that's made to elders in the New Testament is in Acts chapter 11, verses 29 and 30, where there's this famine down in Judea, and there are funds that need to be given to help to take care of these needy saints, and it's brought and it's given to the elders to take care of that. Now, I will say, and you'll see this, I think, in a slide that Marty has tonight, that earlier on, the apostles are doing some of the work that we're going to find the elders end up doing. Now, obviously, elders don't do everything apostles did. That was a unique role. But there were some things, especially in the church in Jerusalem, that apostles did that later we're going to find elders doing. And here, similar to what some apostles had done before, when there was a need, the monies were provided to the elders to make some decisions about it. In Acts chapter 14, when Paul and Barnabas had gone through and begun to convert a number of people in what today is Turkey, they came back through the cities where they had been and were told that they had appointed elders for them in every church. And so it must have been something really important about it that early on, these elders were appointed, these churches had those elders. Now, a lot of those that were converted there in Acts 14 and in the running up to Acts chapter 15 are Gentiles who now for the first time are a part of God's people. What are you going to do with these Gentiles if they're part of God's people when you've got God's law? You've got the old law that's there. We would call it old law. They would just say it's the law. What's the responsibility that all these new converts have to that law? Well, that was a controversy. They didn't know exactly, some of them, what to do. And some men had gone out and disturbed these Gentile converts. So in Acts 15, in Jerusalem, there was a gathering. If you look at verse 6 of Acts chapter 15, it says that the apostles and elders gathered to consider the matter. You would expect the apostles to be involved in kind of settling out. No, this is what the truth is. This is what should be done. This is what ought to be asked of these Gentiles. But the elders were involved in that as well. So here's a doctrinal question. What's the right thing to do? And the elders are involved in determining what that ought to be. What should they both ask of them, and how do they communicate that out to those that perhaps have heard this false teaching along the way? In Acts chapter 20, this is some years later, Paul has been in Ephesus for 3 years. He's going to make another journey down to Jerusalem. He was part of that group in Acts chapter 15. And when he's going to make this journey, along the way, he has an opportunity to stop and to call the elders, it says in verse 17 of Acts 20, to come to him because, well, he doesn't expect to ever be with them again. We'll talk more about this on Sunday night or Sunday afternoon. And so he has an opportunity to talk to them, to say some things that are important about the work that they're doing, the elders there in Ephesus. And then when he actually gets to Jerusalem, interestingly enough, he goes and he meets with the elders of the church in Jerusalem. And these elders are going to ask and request something of Paul that they believe would help the unity of that group. I'm going to come back to this passage and just a little bit later when we look more specifically at some of the things that elders actually do. In Acts 4, they are presented as being shepherds who are a gift to the church. Apostles are, evangelists are, teachers, but it also is saying that shepherds, elders are a gift to the church in order to accomplish a very specific purpose there. And so if you notice, we've left the book of Acts. We're now kind of thumbing our way through some of the epistles of Paul. So he mentions in the book of Ephesians, the elders there. In Philippians, he just addresses it straight up to the overseers and to the deacons that are there. And so we know right away in the church at Philippi, there were these elders, these overseers. In 1 Thessalonians 5, he comes back and talks to them here about esteem those, as he describes those that are over you. And I think that's a reference again to elders. He's telling them those that have some rule who are over you, you ought to esteem them, but you need to esteem them because of the work that they're doing, not because of any special honor on their part, but the actual work that these men are involved in doing. And then in Titus 1 in verse 5, and so we're not going to dig too deep in qualifications, but it is interesting the way that Paul leads into describing who would serve as an elder. He's saying to Titus, look, what you need to do is to put what remains into order and appoint elders in every city as I direct you. That would seem to imply that there's kind of something missing, that ideally what God wants for his churches, for his people, is that they have elders among them that could serve and accomplish what God has in mind for those elders. And if they're not there, there's something that's kind of missing. There's something that remains to be put in place that would bring them into greater order, if you will. And of course, we've mentioned Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3 talk about those qualifications. And in 1 Timothy 5, it comes back to elders again. It talks about those that are ruling well, that they might be worthy of double honor. It's appropriate to support an elder. And so sometimes elders perhaps have full-time jobs, as we talked about, but there are other times when the church could be involved and to some degree or another, especially for those that are teaching and supporting them. And then into the letter of Peter. So we've gone through the epistles of Paul. We've looked at Acts. There's stuff said in Peter's epistle. In 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter writes to elders as a fellow elder. And I don't know how many times I had taught this material before. It just suddenly, it's like, well, isn't that the strangest, most unusual? There's so much more I want to know about that than I know. Here's an apostle who's also an elder. Why was that necessary? Why was that beneficial? I have, by the way, I have absolutely no idea to that. I'm just intrigued by it. But I think it says something important about the role. But more than that, in 5 verses there at least, Peter is saying some things that I think are beneficial for us in gaining a better understanding about the work of elders. So along the way, we'll look at some of that. Hebrews 13 was mentioned there. There may even be another verse besides these two in Hebrews 13. So whoever wrote the Hebrew letter, assume it's not Paul, we're up to yet another writer of the New Testament talking about elders. And then James does as well. James says that you should, if you're sick, and that word could be rendered, it would fit well with a lot of what we'll talk about, it could be rendered weak. It could have reference to spiritually weak, not necessarily just those that are physically sick, but regardless, I would argue also those that are physically sick are typically in some type of spiritual jeopardy. You know, periods of sickness sometimes can cause you to question God and to move away. And so regardless, person that's sick, he says, call for the elders. There's a benefit in the company and association with elders. And so all of these passages you look at, that's quite a bit, right? And if you've been listening along the way, you probably noticed that we went through different terms. And when we talk about elders, we said this is a weekend to talk about elders. Along the way, what we heard there were, of course, there were some references made to elders. If you are a King James aficionado, you love that translation. There are some places where it uses the idea of presbytery as the word. That's the translation for an eldership or for a group of elders. We just don't use that term much anymore, but you might find that. But another term here, I've talked about overseers. They're Philippians chapter 1, verse 1. Your translation could easily say bishop. That's maybe the original way it was most often translated. And then finally there's this, we've talked about shepherds or pastors is another way that it's translated. And then we'll add one more thing to this as well. Sometimes I believe there's a reference made to elders, and it doesn't use these terms. It just references the work that they're doing, the responsibility that they have. And so it speaks of them as being either leaders or those that are over you, who have some rule over you. And that seems pretty clear that that's a reference to elders as well. One thing I'm not going to take the time, we have some more important things to talk about tonight, is to try to show you that these terms are all used interchangeably. There's only one office. And along the way, of course, you're looking at that, you're probably thinking, no, in the religious world, these titles have been pulled out, applied to lots of different things. But in the New Testament, they're all referencing just one role. And you can see that in the way that they're used interchangeably in a number of passages that we're just not going to go to tonight. Instead, I'd like to spend a moment telling you at least some, just give you a first flavor before we get into more detail in the workshop and in some things Marty will talk about tonight, about what elders actually do. One of the things that they are said to do, we had that passage we mentioned a little while ago in 1 Timothy chapter 5 in verse 17. They rule. They have some element of authority. Elders are going to make some decisions, and there's an expectation that those decisions would be followed. And that's one of those things, as you know, that maybe just from the beginning makes us feel just a little bit uncomfortable about that whole idea. You know, that somebody's going to rule or have some authority or make some decisions on our behalf. Sometimes we're a little uncomfortable with those things. But the passages are really clear. That is a responsibility of elders, that they need to make those kinds of decisions. And then we mentioned 1 Peter chapter 5. I think there's a number of things implied in 1 Peter 5 that help us to understand what elders would actually do. Let's think about a couple of those. There's one thing that's just kind of said very specifically there. It's the idea that they are to shepherd the flock that's among them. They are to, if you think about it, and we're going to use the illustration of the members as being like sheep. Here's a flock. It's made up of sheep, and those elders are to be involved in shepherding them. And we could pull a lot of understanding about what shepherds do. It ought to help us to know what elders would do. But in that same passage, it talks about doing this work not under compulsion. And I think that implies that elders somebody might be pushed into the role of being an elder. You know, you just got to do this. Or you're kind of forced into that role in some way in which they're not willing to do it. I mean, you know, part of the qualifications is that they ought to desire the work. But what I really want you to think about from this idea of compulsion is it must be some kind of selection process that goes on. There must be some kind of an appointment. It is a specific role, an office that they have. And so if they're not doing it under compulsion but willingly, there's something they're taking on. There's some task in which they've been asked to serve in this role. Another thing I think that comes out of this passage is that it's not for shameful gain. And if it's not for shameful gain, that must mean there must be some opportunity in which somebody could take advantage of the role. And I would just simply say, I think that what this implies is that they are handling money. They may even be receiving support, like the 1 Timothy 5 passage. But the work of the church that's done through the treasury, the contribution that we all make, elders are making decisions about that. You saw that already. We'll come back to it in a minute. They're in Acts chapter 11. And so this seems to imply that they've got some decision making over some of the funds that the church has provided for the work. But they're not to do it in a domineering way. They're ruling, but never in a domineering way. There's a specific way in which God expects his leaders to act. Think about Mark chapter 10, for example, being servant leaders. And so they're not to do it domineering, but even that would imply that elders do have this responsibility to give instructions with an expectation that they would be followed, but it's the manner in which they give it is especially important according to Peter here in 1 Peter 5. And so there's some other passages as well. We talked about Ephesians 4 in verse 11. They're to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. And there are a number of other things that come out of Ephesians 4 that begins to paint a picture of what the whole church should be doing ideally, how it should be building up one another, making sure that no one is left as a child. And I believe you're going to spend some time even tonight talking about this passage here. But it's the elders who have this responsibility to equip the saints so that those things are accomplished in the verses that follow this, verse 11 through 16. We already mentioned the idea that they would go and they would pray and spend time with those that are sick or are weak. And then they lead and make decisions in matters that might affect the whole church. I can't stress enough about that one-to-one role with individual members, but elders also make decisions that affect the whole body. You can think about what might be a decision, since I haven't asked you a question in a while. You might have thought I forgot about that, right? What might be a decision that elders would make that would affect this whole church? Okay. Now, that sounds a little drastic, but by the way, right now at Embry Hills, we're struggling with the fact that our air conditioning unit, we might be at about 25% capacity on Sunday. Last Sunday morning, we were at 0 capacity in the auditorium, which was a little hard. And so fortunately, our preacher preached a 10-minute lesson last Sunday morning. But we're having to make some decisions about, like, when do we meet? How long will we meet? Will we come back? We usually come back at 5 o'clock on Sundays. We actually have a decision to make about some of those things. What's another decision maybe, though, that would be made that affects the whole group? Can you think of one? They make a lot of those decisions. Okay, hiring an evangelist. You had one comment? Same one, right? Yeah, if as long as the preacher stays, that's great. But if they were to leave, then now they got to make that decision. I would say elders made a decision as to whether Marty and I are going to come this weekend. And you can judge how good of a decision that was, along the way, how we do. But that's a decision maybe that we're trying to make a public address. This is affecting everybody. And, what time do you meet? If this building is not adequate or if there's a major repair, there are a lot of things that elders may do that affect the whole group. But here's some benevolence. That group in Acts chapter 11, they were in need as a whole group. There was a famine in the area. Who's going to make the best decision as to how these funds would be spent? Well, it was the elders. That was who the monies were put into the hands of to be trusted to make that decision. We already talked about doctrinal matters. The elders here would be protecting you from making sure that there's not false teaching that's given, or if something new comes in and we don't really know whether or not that's truth or not, well, they'd have a high responsibility to be paying attention to that and making a decision about whether something would be taught or not taught here along the way. And here's another one. Sometimes there are just these personality issues. If you look there in Acts chapter 21, you'll find that what happened was that when the Apostle Paul went into Jerusalem, on that trip, the elders asked him to come talk to them. And so James and all the elders were there in talking to Paul. And they told Paul that what he ought to do were certain things that would give comfort to the Christians that were in that city, that Paul had not been out teaching some things that were said about him that were not true. In other words, they knew that Paul's presence among them would potentially be a divisive thing. And the elders told an apostle what he ought to do to make sure that there was peace among that group. Why? Because they were protecting the group. And they were helping Paul to be more effective because they knew that church. They knew the members there, and they knew the things that had been said about Paul that were not true. And you know what Paul did? He followed what those elders asked of him, and he did those things in Acts chapter 21. One of the unfortunate memories I have before Kay and I moved to Atlanta was to watch a church literally just fall apart because somebody had come among us, a church that did not have elders. And in that group where we had no elders and we were trying to make every decision in business meetings and things among the men, a decision had to be made about this new person as to whether they should be a member, and if they are, whether or not they should lead in worship, and whether they had done things in the past that were sufficient to take care of some past circumstance. And by the time we finished all of the arguments and wrangling and everything else over that, over an 8-month, a 1-year process, there was almost no longer a church there. In a college town where the weakest members, the youngest members, were highly affected. If we'd had elders, the elders would have made that decision quickly. It wouldn't have pleased everybody, but it would have been made with the wisdom of God's word. It would have been made efficiently in a way in which it would have been explained to everyone, and you would have been expected to follow and to do that, and that group would have stayed together. I'm confident that with good elders, that situation could have been handled that instead ended up tearing that group apart. And so I want to end with this thought here before we take the 5-minute break. I want to ask the question of why is it that churches really need elders? What is so important about having elders? I think it has to do with the nature of the work. That what God wants elders to be doing points to why the role is so important. And I would first of all suggest that it's not primarily this idea of leading the whole group at one time. We've talked about some decisions that elders would make that would affect the whole congregation. Obviously, that's an essential part of the work. But I would suggest to you that's not the primary task that God has laid on elders. It's just one of the responsibilities that they have. Along the way, we're going to call that flock shepherding. If you have a shepherd, sometimes a shepherd makes decisions that affect the whole flock. Where are we going to pasture tonight? Where will the whole flock find water? Where can we get food for the whole flock? We believe, that the primary work, the greater focus is really on the shepherding of every soul that's within the body. And you think about this as sheep shepherding. You can get the picture of the 99 and 1, of the shepherd that leaves the 99 because of the importance of just that one sheep that's wandered away and wants to go and to find that one sheep. Let me give you 3 passages kind of quickly to make this point. And we'll focus on it more as we go, but if you'll just bear with me quickly through these 3 passages. Hebrews 13, verse 17 was mentioned earlier. I think this is one of the more intimidating passages that any elder ever has to face and think about. What it says is to the rest of us, those of us that aren't elders, those that are supposed to follow those elders, it says, look, do this. Obey your leaders and submit to them for, what are they doing? They're keeping watch over your souls. As those who will have to give an account, let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage, it says. I'm sorry, I thought that was underlined as well. It would be of no advantage to you if you don't do this. Now, you understand this. Obviously, elders are responsible for what happens to the group as a whole. But one day, we're all going to stand before God and give an individual account. And if I am going to take advantage of the leadership of the elders, this is talking about what I individually do. Because they're going to have to give an account for my soul. And I'm going to be judged on what I have done. And so you begin to see this individual nature of what elders are accountable for and what they are to be doing. I think that 1 Peter 5, in the middle of that, if you remember, as Peter was saying to them, you need to shepherd the flock that's among you. But he calls out to them the chief shepherd. Who's the chief shepherd? Jesus. Christ is. And so if you go to John 10 and think about what Jesus said when he was describing what the chief shepherd is like, describing himself. And by the way, there's some good passages in the Old Testament that also kind of show this as well, like Ezekiel 34. And I think you'll see the same kind of emphasis in those. Here Jesus says that the good shepherd is one who calls his own sheep by name. He knows each one. It's not just about the whole group. It's also about them individually. They know his voice. He knows his own and his own know him. There is an individual relationship that's formed between those elders, or the shepherd and the sheep, and it ought to be between elders and those that they are accountable for. And then one more passage. This one actually is out of the qualifications, so it's not that we never go and talk about that as part of these discussions. Here's one of the things in the qualifications I think that speaks to what elders are to do. Now, here it's saying that you would want a man who can manage his household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? It's saying, look to a man in his house in the way that he's conducted himself as a father, not say as a husband as well, but how he's conducted himself as a father to know whether or not he's going to be somebody that would care for God's church. So ask yourself this question for a moment. What's a picture of a good father who would be prepared and ready to step in and care for God's church? When you think about a father who manages his house so well, are you thinking about that father that on Sunday morning at whatever the designated time is, the whole family's at the back door. Every boy's got his shirt tucked in just right. Every shoe is tied well. They're all clean. They've all, they're ready to go, man. I mean, the orderliness of that household is incredible. How organized it is. Is that your picture of a great dad? Or isn't it really the father that knows every one of his children? He knows their heart. And he knows the difference between them. If he has 2 daughters, he knows the difference between those 2 daughters. He knows the difference between what motivates his daughter and what motivates his son. He sees he knows enough about their life to have an intimate relationship with each one, to which he can speak with a voice of not just authority, but a voice of concern that they listen to because they know he has their best interest at heart. If that's more of your picture of a father, and you know that it's done on a one-to-one basis with those children, I think you're beginning to get the idea of what an effective elder is meant to be and how helpful it would be to every one of us as followers of Christ. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think I've used my portion of the time, and we'll take a 5-minute break. And
and we're going to stick to 5 minutes. Okay, so 5 minutes, we're starting back. And for those of you When Marty finishes, one of our elders here, Patrick Sneed's just going to come when Marty finishes and say the prayer. I'm not going to get up and say anything else, to which I know all of you will be grateful. But remember, for men especially, or for men only, tomorrow, beginning at 9 o'clock in the morning, we'll be meeting here. Certainly we'd love to have any man, young man who can come and be with us, but that will be tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So just keep that in your minds. And then after Marty finishes, Patrick will lead us into prayer as we close. Marty?
On? Yes. Russ usually gives a little bit of a warning that there might be a quiz on what he presented. So in keeping with our efforts to make this a little bit more like a class, we'll probably begin with a quiz of some kind, which is, do you remember what those passages are that had to do with the elders' work? All right? So we know two passages that won't be up there. That's the qualification chapters, 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. Can you think of any of those? That he actually gave a good survey of some of the things that have to do with the work of elders. I don't even have the whole list up there, but how many can you think of? Acts 20, good. 1 Peter 5, great. Good. Keep going. James 5. Hey, there's two that are all in chapter 5. It turns out there are 4 of them that come from a chapter 5 of a book. So we've got James and 1 Peter. What are the other 2? Did somebody say 1 Timothy 5? That's one, and there's one more. 1 Thessalonians 5, and I'll spend a little bit of time on that tonight, and others. So we've got James 5, 1 Peter 5. I call it the lucky chapter because it has an unlucky number in it. Hebrews 13, and there's several verses there. And I think one of the more powerful ones, as Russ has said about that. Okay, yes, that's enough. Here's my answers to that question. 1 Thessalonians 5. I hope you sense this methodology we're trying to follow. Our lessons, we try to begin, and this will happen tomorrow. The first thing we'll do is we will open up the Bible, or at least have a list of Bible verses, and we're just going to work them over and underline them and see what implications there are and understand their context. From there, we may make some statements that are matters of judgment, right? But if you don't begin with the Word and build on that, it seems to me we're not approaching it the way God wants us to. Let's look at what we know He said, see what the implications are, and if there's some judgment to be expressed or wondered about or speculated on, that comes last, if at all. But here's what 1 Thessalonians 5 says. Interesting thing about Thessalonians, I think it's the first letter written to a single church. Maybe Galatians came before that in terms of writing. I don't know. I'm not taking a position on that. But the Thessalonian church was just a few months old. And this is out of that first letter that he wrote back, having heard the good news, from Timothy and Silas that came back. And he says this, we urge you, brethren, to recognize those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you. Do you see a hint of an action verb there? Right? Admonish you. Does that sound like flock or sheep shepherding just at the outset? Admonish you. What? It does, it comes to mind as sheep, but I can imagine a situation where the whole group, somehow or another, the problems are so pervasive that I maybe admonish you as a flock. My experience in leadership is that doesn't do very good. You really have to talk to individuals, but that's just a piece of judgment. But look at the verse before this. And I'll put it in gray because I don't think it's about elders particularly, but it provides a context. Therefore, comfort each other and edify one another just as you are also doing. Who's that written to? Who's it written to? A command. Okay, the whole church or individuals in the church? Individuals, one another. You notice that? And the context of this whole text is, hey, there are problems of all kinds. In fact, look at the verse afterward. What does it say? Now we exhort you, brethren, warn those who are unruly, comfort the faint-hearted, uphold the weak, be patient with all. Does that mean people who are all 4 of those things are unruly, faint-hearted, weak, and need patience? Or is that just a whole bunch of different kind of people in the church that need different kind of help? Isn't that obvious? And so in the context of that, now who's doing it? Who's the one another again? It's all the individuals in the church, right? And they're looking at each other and saying, boy, this person needs some patience. This person, I think, is really discouraged. This person is frightened, right? They're faint-hearted. They need to be strengthened. And all of us are doing that, aren't we? According to this, or at least we're commanded to. Does that make sense? And in the middle of that, who especially would you listen to? Who's trying to admonish you in whatever way is needed? It would be that shepherd. Y'all see that? And that's the context of that text, of that verse. Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. I'll just make a little point about that. If you think about an elder, and sometimes I do this exercise, close your eyes, picture an elder doing his work. You know what I mean? And it's a little bit like what's the passage you think of when you think of elders, and 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 might come to mind. If you picture an elder doing his work, right? Now, you've already heard a bunch of our words about our prejudice on this, but oftentimes the picture that comes to my mind is a man who's standing right here in front of the, and I'm glad to see y'all are a sound congregation. You know, but the man is standing in front of the in remembrance of me table. And what's he doing? He's saying, well, this afternoon we're going to meet at 4:30 instead of 5, or something like that. Y'all know what I mean? Special contribution. We've decided to hire a preacher. Here's what we're going to study for the next, is that really the best picture of an elder doing his shepherding work? But it is kind of what we picture. You know what I mean? What is a picture that's implied by this? What is his tool? To be ruling, to be convincing, to be admonishing, as we saw in 1 Thessalonians 5. What's his tool? They labor it's all based on using the word to motivate people. I think we're going to see that especially tomorrow as we talk with the men. Even in private counseling, even in matters which you might think of are just giving personal advice for life, they ought to be rooted in the text of the Scripture. And that's very important. And of course, it has to do with the preparation the man would make to be ready to do that, his knowledge of the word. Russ mentioned this. I'm going to try not to say that. We've been hearing each other say the same things over and over, so it is likely the case that most of what I say Russ has already said or said in a different way. But is this sheep or flock shepherding, this James passage? That's pretty clear, right? It's not a congregational thing. In fact, is it even possible that the elder would go and service that sick or weak person's needs, and most of the church, maybe all the rest of the church, would never know about that? Is that possible? Is it possible that might even be beneficial, that it was kept private in some way? 1 Peter 5, I think I'll skip that, but you remember that passage. I could say more, but... And then these two passages from from Hebrews chapter 13, there's also a reference in verse 24. But again, this rule over, I don't want to make this point at this. I might say it again because I'll forget that I've said it. Who is this passage written to? Who is this command given to? And maybe I should make this multiple choice. A, it's written to the shepherds. B, it's written to the sheep. It's sheep. It's obviously sheep. Isn't it interesting? And I think you'll see this in all the other relationships, husbands and wives and fathers and children. Is the husband commanded to make sure his wife submits to him? Is that the way it reads? No, what's the command to the husband? Love. What's the command to the wife? Submit. You see that. We're seeing this too. The elders are not commanded to make sure those flock submit to you. And you'll see when we look at the elders, it's more don't lord it over the flock, right? Don't make it like they're your slaves working for your benefit. That's the warning to the shepherds. But to the sheep, it's pretty clear, hey, there's submission required. And you see that pattern throughout all the texts. Maybe there's one in the middle where Timothy is told about those who rule well. Now, that's not to an elder. Maybe Timothy's a sheep, but he's basically just saying to the evangelist, this is what you should be doing operationally. I don't think that's an exception, but it's a little outside that model. Ephesians 4, we're going to spend more time on this at the end of the lesson, so I'm going to skip that for now. Acts 20, Russ will have a lesson on this on Sunday. Again, I will say it more times. tonight, the ones we most are concerned about are those who struggle. Because we're watching in behalf of souls. We that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak comes to mind, right? And who likes to admit that they're the weak? I don't know, but that puts the burden on all of us, really, to be watching out for the souls of others. All right, this is another piece of hermeneutics, you might say. And it's a map of really decisions, congregational actions and decisions made as recorded by Luke in the book of Acts. And you see early on, they continued steadfastly in the apostles' teaching and fellowship, chapter 2, verse 42. They laid their gifts at the apostles' feet. The apostles appointed men to deacon tables. In the Greek, that word serving tables is deacon, right? Whether you believe they're deacons or not, I don't really care. It's a nice prototype of qualifications and service and priority of work, which we'll talk about. But anyway, you see the pattern there. Now, as these bubbles get blue, what I'm trying to say there is it appears the elders had either joint or primary even duties in those tasks, authority over those tasks, as the book progresses. I think there's a pattern, I'll just mention it briefly, that begins in the Old Testament. When Theophilus, if he was just a real individual or a lover of God generally or whatever, when he got the letter, this historical account, actually the second one that Luke had written, and he read in chapter 11 that they laid the gifts at the feet of the elders. I wonder what he thought. Luke hadn't explained elders at that point. Later in 14, you will see them appointed in every city. I think somebody help me say that word. Theophilus, right. I think he knew about elders because that had been a pattern of God's rule since the Israelites in Egypt. And you can see in that pattern, they were kind of corporate leaders. They would sit in the city gates. But, I'm thinking of the story of Ruth and others. Why were they in the city gates? Were they doing their oversight so they could see the whole city? Or is it because they needed to be available to settle matters that people brought to them? Look at the Old Testament law. For example, a man had something against, say, married a wife. I won't go into the details of that story, but bring the evidence to the elders. And so I think what you see there is, sure, there's a public visibility, but you also see that they're there to settle matters on a personal basis as well. That's a pattern God's always had in place. Older men, wiser men, ruling in corporate matters, but also settling individual disputes. Anyway, that's that. But here's the point Russ was making. And that is, early, the gifts, and Barnabas sold a field. And, that they were laid at the apostles' feet for distribution. Later, when there was a famine, they were laid at the feet of the elders. Maybe the apostles were not there. But in any case, the elders were doing that very same thing. And similar to that incident in chapter 9, where this weird fellow Saul, who had been laying waste the church, shows up and wants to be a member in Jerusalem. Can you imagine any problems with that? Right? Yes, they were afraid of him. But Barnabas, brought him in, and the apostles seem to have made that decision about whether he could be going in and coming out and other things with the church in Jerusalem. But later, in the incident in chapter 21 that we talked about, it's James and the elders of the church in Jerusalem who confront Paul now and about his behavior to protect the unity of the church. So I think there's a pretty clear picture that the elders served as prototype examples, as I think also the table deacons did as well in chapter 6 for the elders and deacons in the operational church where the apostles were not there in person, if that makes sense. So that's a little bit of a hermeneutical approach we're going to take. All right, flock shepherding. It's clearly referred to in the text as something that elders do. They guide the whole flock. Here's a couple of examples. Y'all know that flock and church are both collective nouns. We have English teachers here, or English students here, English speakers here. What do we have? Y'all know what collective nouns are. They're in the singular, but it really is a collection of things. And if you opened it up, you'd see multiple things. So a church has what in it? Now, this is a mixed metaphor. I don't really know what the right answer to this. Has called out people in it, right? More than one. A body, collective, has what in it? members, right? And you can think about 1 Corinthians 12 and others where it talks about a plurality and a diversity, really, of those members. And so flock, collective noun, but it represents plurality of sheep. And so that's kind of the idea. But here he says, shepherd the church, the singular thing. And here, shepherd the flock, which is over you. But notice in verse 3 of 1 Peter 5, don't be lords over those entrusted. Now he's starting to make a reference, it seems to me, to individuals that make up that church or that flock. So I think it's a scriptural idea. You'll just have to tolerate Russ and me, speaking of English teachers, when we use these terms, flock shepherding and sheep shepherding. We've just appropriated it. But y'all understand the difference between those two? Well, I have a picture that will help us. If you're not into words, we'll deal with pictures, right? So there's flock shepherding, and it is collective decisions that affect the whole group. And the other is sheep shepherding, and that would be the counseling, the development, the warning, the advising, the exhorting, rebuking, comforting each sheep individual. Let's try some of these things. What would a decision about what to study in our Bible class curriculum? You think it's flock? I got one vote for flock. Everybody okay with that? Yeah. Somebody mentioned before, how about choosing an evangelist or even a bunch of knuckleheads to come and talk about elders for the weekend? Is that a flock or sheep shepherding thing? It's flock, of course you can see that. What about changing the time of the worship? Flock, okay. What about counseling a couple at night over the kitchen table through a crisis in their marriage? Where would you put that? Sheep. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Or a person who has an addiction or personal problem or even some illness that's maybe even threatening their faith. What about disciplining a member for immorality, let's say? And I mean by that a withdrawal in the 1 Corinthians 5 sense. Y'all know that passage about the man who had taken his father's wife, stepmother, I hope. I mean, I don't hope, but I hope it's not the other thing. But okay, so you're saying it's both, aren't you? Yeah, and that's my point of this illustration. He says, I'm going to deliver such one for the destruction of the flesh. Why? To save his soul. That's a sheep thing, right? And yet, there's another image that Paul uses in that text that really looks like a collective thing, which is, what's that other image that he uses? Chemical, by the way. Leaven of the whole lump. So he's concerned about a problem. Now, it's really kind of the same problem, but it's solving in both directions. And what I'm going to try to look at tonight as I talk about flock shepherding, because I feel a little bit hypocritical. Which did we say that was the primary work of the shepherd, was sheep shepherding? Well, what's my talk on? It's flock shepherding. So what I want to try to do is put those together to show that they really have a relationship that's very strong and very important. And that's what I'd like to try to do tonight. So here's my outline. I want to talk about the church and our misconceptions about it, what a church does, New Testament pattern, and then how does the flock support the leadership, all right? So let's start with misconceptions of the church. Now, I'll start by saying nobody here, I'm sure, has any of these misconceptions, right? But if you did, it's possible that you might select a leader or even judge a leader who exists already in the wrong way. You agree with that? Yeah, I mean, well, maybe you don't. We'll just cover the material and say, well, here's one wrong model. I used to have emission inspection stations, but I discovered that Alabama does not have such a thing. Is that true? You just send your pollution right over to Georgia. Is that what you do? But you do have driver's license? You have that? Okay, that's good. We'll go with that. A driver's license bureau. And what happens is, to be legally compliant, you need to go get that driver's license renewed every, what, 4 years here? Well, it's your most favorite thing to do. Is that right? It's just love to do it. No, it isn't something you do. And you think about it, what the goals of a license bureau are is to help you fulfill an obligation or duty. Isn't that right? And really, beyond that, they're not trying to entertain you. They're not trying to change your life in any way. In fact, the less time you're there, probably the happier they are about it. But still, You got to be legal. You got to do the right things, fill out the right forms. If you were running a license bureau as a leader, how would you be judged? I mean, what would make a good leader of a license bureau? Y'all know what I'm trying to say with that? Okay. Efficiency. Right. If I could just even drive through, I wouldn't even have to get out of my car. What do you think of that? Or maybe it's all online, or I don't know. You know what I mean? That kind of way we'd like to go. It's as efficient. However, there's another thing besides efficiency, and that's make it legal. I mean, we can't violate the law or, give you an invalid license. So that's the way a leader would be judged. Don't you agree with that? We never would think of the church as that, would we? Where we come together and we got to take the Lord's Supper. We got to meet on the first day because that's a command of the Lord. But, I wish the elders would just make it a lot more efficient. You know what I mean? We never get out on time. The Baptists get to the restaurants before we can get there. Y'all know what I mean by that? And really, I don't think you have to have this to be scriptural. I mean, it'd be legal if you just had the Lord's Supper, I guess, and maybe y'all know what I mean? And I get a little upset if the guy goes too long or something's just inefficient. I don't know why we do it that way. We would never judge a church or its leaders by that, would we? We would never do that. Well, here's a better model. When Mary died, I had a few things. I thought, well, I guess I have a little extra time. My bucket list included, I wanted to learn and sing in a barbershop quartet chorus. Y'all know what that is? And you may even have heard of the Society of the Preservation and Encouragement of Barbershop Quartet Singing in America. I think they've shortened the title in recent years. But it's a real organization. And I went, and just so you know, I did my audition, and I made the group, the Stone Mountain Chorus, and I was in there. The purpose of that organization was to get people together who really love to do the same thing as other people in that organization. Y'all know what I mean by that? They love singing. They sang for 3 hours, standing on risers. And these are old guys, older than me, most of them. They loved it. They loved it. Now, if you tried out and you sang off key, what do you think? You weren't invited, right? And really, if you caused other kind of trouble in the group, maybe some kind of division, and kept us from singing, which is why we're meeting at all anyway, you wouldn't be welcome either. And so how would a leader be judged in an organization meant to get people who love the same things together and enable them to do those wonderful things they love? How would they be judged? Okay, how well they sing if you want to take of that, but don't you think it's the experience? I'm here to have fun and enjoy this thing, and if it's not enjoyable, well, what's the point? You get that? You see that? My mom was in a garden club, similar thing. We're doing the thing we enjoy. Now, the church would never be judged that way, right? That is my purpose and pleasure, and the success is just a quality experience. And there might also be he's recruited a lot of good singers, right? Or people, so this club has grown over time, and that's just enhanced the experience, right? I wonder if sometimes we think of a church as the Society for the Preservation and Encouragement of Bible Study in America. Because we love Bible study, don't we? We love to sing. We have whole services dedicated to just singing. We love that, right? But the problem is if someone comes in and it's somewhat disruptive, or we have a preacher who's not as entertaining as we thought he might be, right? Or there's trouble between members, what's happening to my experience there? And might the leaders be judged based on, well, these are not the lessons that I enjoy the most, for example. We'll talk about that some more. And still, it is something we all ought to enjoy. But I don't think that's a good picture of the church either. Nor should we judge the leaders based on how good the singing is and how well organized the service and how peaceful the church is and that kind of thing. Here's one I don't think we don't have any trouble with that. A business model. How's a business judged? Easy. Profit. It's a number. It could be head count, whatever. I was talking to Josh before we started, when I became an elder, the church was 250 members. And after the 11, 12 years I served, it was up to 350. What do y'all think of my tenure as an elder? You don't have any information about that. You understand what I mean by that? Maybe you know the church didn't have a big split. Maybe that's all you know. But is that a good way to measure? It's not by numbers. Brand recognition or, growth of members or budget size or something like that. And yet I think sometimes we tend to look at the church in that way. Maybe we don't. I should never say this. Nobody would say out loud, I think the church is really just like a business. But I wonder if we think about it that way. And worse, judge our leaders based on those kinds of assessments. I hope not. Okay, well then what is it? What does it do? It kind of raises the question. So I've tried to list some things that churches do, and there's a whole bunch. And you probably think, well, they do the 5 acts of worship. That's usually the first 5 answers you get to this. But look at the New Testament church, at all the things the church did besides meeting together and doing the singing and Bible teaching and praying and other things in a kind of an assembly, public assembly. I wonder if that's our view of the church. Are we out to do something more than just come together and do the singing? Are we interested in finding needy people? And really, they get better as you go down the list till I finally get down to Hebrews 10, stirring one another up to love and good works. Maybe that's the heart of what we're trying to do. Don't know. And actually, I can point to elders' decisions in a similar way. Here are examples of collective flock activities, but look at things that elders actually did. They just supported the needy. That's a flock thing. They met to consider a doctrinal question. They decided to write a letter. They chose men to send with the letter. They met to discuss their own work in Acts chapter 20. They took visitor actions, as Russ has mentioned, to avoid future problems. They gave gifts or appointed men to do certain things. They prayed for and anointed the sick. So I think these are flock-type decisions. Don't you agree with that for the most part? Maybe this appointment of a man, Timothy's laying on the hands of the presbytery, I'm not sure what that is. It feels like an appointment, not some type of a miraculous gift, but I don't know if it's a public work, it would have been somewhat of a flock decision. So these look like, flock shepherding things, I guess, to look at them. And are there advantages to having a group of men whose responsibility is to make a decision? Some of us have lived through men's business meetings years ago. For me, it was a long time ago. And talk about a difficulty. And also fraught with potential for division, for bad behavior, setting bad example to weaker Christians, men who are in the meeting, all these things I have experienced myself. So isn't it helpful to have a group of men who already know they have to make the decision? Is that a helpful thing? It makes it efficient. I think that's part of God's plan. If everybody's in charge, who's really in charge? Yeah, exactly. On the other hand, not on the other hand, but in addition to that, I think it's helpful to know that it is your responsibility to handle things maybe before they're a crisis, right? Oh, the roof is leaking. We thought about looking at a new roof several years ago, but we just decided to wait, see what happened. Y'all know what I mean. I take the initiative. I get ahead of a problem, like James was doing when Paul showed up with his gift for the church in Jerusalem. Get ahead of it. Try to prevent it. Take the initiative and so on. And also, we like to think that older men who meet those qualifications with spiritual judgment, who are not self-willed, or not ready to have a fight about something, who know the word very well, will make better decisions. In these ways, here's some ways. Number one, there are some things that are okay. They're kind of lawful. Paul uses a personal example here, of eating meats is the context. But they're really not helpful, or they're not edifying. They don't build somebody up. They form bad precedents. Maybe they have some way of forming bad habits or something. Not all things really build me up, so I think about that. Here's an interesting passage, 1 Timothy 5. In discussion of the needy widows, Paul makes the point to Timothy that if the family can support this needy widow, they should, so that the church not be burdened. That sounds like... Do you feel that the church is burdened by having to worship? I hope you don't. That ought to be something that we think is, we enjoy. So it almost suggests that there are some things the church may have to do, right? May have to, but it's not the priority. And if there was a way to avoid that, say by an individual woman supporting her own mom or something like that, we ought to do that because that's not what we're really about. Think about the example in Acts chapter 6. The apostles appointed these table deacons to serve tables. Why did they do that? What was their reason? Would it have been sinful for the apostles to go and help these hungry Grecian widows? Of course not, right? But what does he say? That we may give ourselves to prayer and the word. Are you saying to me that it was more important for the apostles to be praying and teaching than it was for them to visit these pitiful widows? Are you saying that? I know you're not saying anything this evening, but anyway, do the apostles say that? They do. It is kind of what they're saying. Not that it's wrong, not that it's not even important, but it's not the most important thing. So the thing about spiritually minded men making these flock decisions is that they're thinking about precedent. They're thinking about what's edifying. They're thinking about what's dangerous and maybe leads to the wrong things. They're thinking about spiritual priorities in the work of the church. Is there a black how to make this thing go away? Is there such a thing? Okay, pretend there's nothing on the screen for a second. I visited somebody in the hospital recently, and I drove up, and there was arrows. One said, deliveries this way. The other one said parking this way, and I went that way. There was a machine, gave me a ticket, eventually took my money for parking. I went in, there was a receptionist telling me which way to go. I noticed there was a restaurant, I think it was a McDonald's or something, in the hospital there. And there was this gift shop. I'm just proving I really did go to the hospital to tell you all these details, right? And then I went down the hall, and there was like accounting or billing or some kind of financial type, go in one direction. And then there was a receiving, and I kept on walking, finally got the elevators and so on. Y'all know you can imagine this experience. What might I conclude about what the mission of the hospital is, having seen all those things? Is the mission of the hospital to park cars? Is it to sell gifts? Is it to provide short order food to people who visit? Is it to collect money? Well, actually nowadays, I'm sorry, don't want to go down that path. All right, but you know what I'm saying. Is it to direct people, in their lives, like the receptionist lady was going to tell me where to go? Is that the mission of the hospital? No, it isn't. Do they do those things? I think those lists that I gave you on those other charts are kind of in that category, right? The elders distributed the money to the needy saints. Is that the mission of the church? Is it the mission of the elders? Well, we need to figure that out. Y'all see what I mean? But just because we see the examples in the New Testament of the elders managing these, and can I use the term operational issues? Do y'all know what that means? It just means making things turn, the machinery operate, in a good way. If you're in business, you know what that means. There's usually a COO. Y'all know what that is, Chief Operations Officer. He's not selling. He's not setting vision. He's not developing technology. He's just making sure that the machinery works, right? I worry that we see all these operational issues and we start to think, well, that is the mission of the church, to park our cars, to keep the lights on, to start the service on time, to make sure the sound system works, right? To conduct classes because that's what we've always done. Y'all see what I'm getting at here? I wonder if the Bible can help us see, besides these operational things that have to be done, what is the mission of the church? And I'd like to look at one particular passage in particular, and that's Ephesians 4. Notice in verse 11 of Ephesians 4, and you might want to open your Bible and just look at the verses before and the verses after. I would just tell you that the chapter begins talking about walking worthily. And what he emphasizes is that you give all diligence to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. You see, and there's one body, he says in the very next verse. Y'all know what that is. What's the emphasis here in Ephesians 4? Especially since it's a Jew-Gentile controversy he's addressed up to that point. He's saying, you guys get along. And he begins by talking about forbearing and bearing with one another. And he ends with talking about forgiveness in this chapter 4. I just want you to know that's his picture that we're putting this mission statement in a way of the church in the middle of. But he says the pastors, shepherds, are gifts from Jesus to help us do whatever it is we're supposed to do. And that's what I want to look at for the most part for the rest of the time. Well, he gave some to be apostles, some prophets. They're still gifts to the church, even though they're not alive, but the things that they delivered to us in the form of truth, oh, what wonderful gifts they are. And that's the very word that the elders use in their rule. But he also gave evangelists, pastors, and teachers. Why? Well, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying. Y'all know the word edifying? Greek, I think, is oikodomeo. It means house building. It's really what the word means. It means you're constructing something, building it up, making it stronger perhaps even. Of the body of Christ. That's a mixed metaphor. But I'll just mention here, so the body is a theme in Ephesians. You understand that. This unified body, Jews and Gentiles together. The head is Christ, exercising control and animating and giving life to the members that are part of it. So bodies is a ubiquitous term in the book of Ephesians. And of course here I think he's looking at a local instance of that body because he's going to talk about our relationships personally to one another. But notice too, he's edifying, which is a building. A building is another theme in Ephesians, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone. You're familiar with that text in chapter 2. It's almost like a mixing of metaphors, but they keep showing up. There's one more metaphor we'll see in just a second. Till we all come to the unity, and there it is again, unity of the faith, knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should be no longer children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness by which they lie in wait to deceive. But speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ. There's the head, from whom, there we are again, the whole body. And I almost think that whole body is a little bit of a synthesis. Yes, he could have just said the body, but why does he say the whole body if he's not thinking about every single member that's in there, right? And he says something like, he talks about the whole family in the previous chapter. The family meaning Jew and Gentile together. But anyway, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share. Do you see an echo of how he began? The equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, service, y'all know that, work of serving. And at the end he says, the effective working by which every part does its share. I'm seeing a mix of kind of the collective picture and the individual picture. I don't know if you can see that yet, right? I mean, for one thing, he talks about that we should be no longer children. Is everyone in the church a child, immature, in danger of being swept away by doctrinal error, as he talks about here? No, they're not. Some are. Some will be. You can be sure of that. But he's already beginning to talk about the difference here. So the edifying of the body, the growth of the body for the edifying of self and love. You see, these are terms that almost echo at the beginning and the end of this text. And there he says the whole body, so the same idea. But notice how it transitions into multiplicity. We all, you get the idea there? Each one of us has to accomplish something for this unifying of the body that's there. He mentions down here every joint. There are lots of joints. I don't think those are the members. I think those are the relationships between the members. Y'all ever build something? The joint is not the board itself. It's the way it attaches and relates to the other board that you're building. Every relationship supplies. And then he goes on to say, every part doing its share. So he really begins and ends with that. Beginning and ending is about really almost the same words. A lot of the same words used again. Edifying of the body, every part doing its share, just kind of collective activity. But for what purpose? And I think that's in the middle. It's in this middle section here. Till we all, each one of us, y'all see, I'm looking at it thinking you're looking at the same verse, but you see that right there at the first of verse 13, till we all, each one of us, come to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God. Is that something that some of us are farther along at than others? Measuring up to now none of us measure to stature, the fullness of Christ, of course, but some of us have made better progress. Some of us have made progress and lost it. It's not necessarily a monotonic thing either. But it's a battle we're all fighting. We're all trying to help each other with. We are all coming to be more like Christ. But in particular, he says that we should no longer be children. Y'all know he doesn't mean chronologically aged children. That's not what he's talking about. What does he mean? And you can tell they're children because of what effect you notice in here. They're unstable, right? They're easily affected. They don't know the truth well enough to defend themselves against the winds of error that blow them one way or the other. Y'all understand that? We don't want any children in the church, do we? Somebody's smiling and nodding yes. We do want children in the church. Are y'all not aware that children, cause trouble? If you've had them, you know that. Are you not aware that children sometimes keep you up at night? That they sometimes engage in inappropriate behavior which you have to go and remedy? That's never happened, right, parents? If you had a business, we talked about the church not being a business, and you had an employee that was messing things up all the time, as we used to say, we had to hire another employee to make up for the mess that this employee was making. What would you do with that employee? I mean, after you got all the HR rules out of the way. But, what would you do? You would try to get rid of them, right, in a business. In fact, if you think about employees in a business and you're doing a ledger sheet, we've got some accountants here. Did I see a nod there? Which side of the ledger sheet are salaries and benefits? Are they on the income side or the outgo side? They're on the bad side. I mean, bad in some accounting sense, right? In fact, the fewer employees, the less the salaries are, the better the business would be by somebody's measure, right? In fact, if you could just license software and have no employees, it would be ideal, right? No cost at all. Is that the way the church is? What is our product in the church? What are we selling to make profit? What is our product? What are we making? By the way, I think the answer is up here. Growth of who? Of children, of members, of Christians. You see, in a business, a non-productive or immature or sloppy employee would be in the way of the work. In the church, what would we say? They are the work. Is that right? When a child is born into a family, you don't say, hey, this is too much trouble. We need to get rid of this thing. It's costing a lot of money. We're not getting enough sleep around here. Oh, no. In the church, in a family, that's what we're doing. That's why we're here. And does it mean we're going to be inconvenienced and kept up late and frustrated over and over? I'm telling you, that is the work. Now, put that in the context of a shepherd. Maybe a metric of a shepherd's work is how much anxiety he's carrying around because he's trying to watch in behalf of souls. And some of them are not making it joyful, but making his life full of grief. I'm quoting from Hebrews 13. Y'all know that. I don't wish that on the shepherds, but I think I have lived it. And now looking back from a much safer position, because, in some ways, although I think all of us, as we saw in 1 Thessalonians 5, bear this burden as well. I really think I was closer to being more Christ-like when I was trying to help a sheep and they were not willing, maybe even abusive to me for my best efforts. Y'all know does that ever happen? Do you think that might ever happen? And I hope that the flock itself might not be as aware of that as the shepherds would be, but still, that's kind of the nature of the work. But not only just no longer be children, but also growing up. And that suggests that even if a child is not troublesome, they have potential. They have things that they can learn to do better. In fact, they might learn how to take care of other children. My second son just had his fourth child, and I was talking to his wife, the mom, and she said, I've had 3 kids. I know the drill. You know, your life kind of ends. Everything's harder. You know what I mean? Everything takes 3 times as long with a baby in the house, right? So I'm making the point I made before. She said, but I did not count on this fact. And it's been a surprising thing. The baby's 3 months old now. She has a 10-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old daughter. Those daughters love that baby. If you've ever had that experience, I didn't. She has been amazed at the help that those kids, only 8 and 10, can be in taking care of that new baby. Man, what a wonderful picture. That we grow up and we don't just keep drawing the attention of the leaders and those that are strong. No, I become the helper. And that begins to be a growing process. So as shepherds, I'm not just taking care of the troublesome ones that are causing me anxiety and trouble and cost and sleep and all those things. I'm training those who have great potential to be maybe shepherds one day, or maybe not, maybe never. But they're helpers. We have one of our shepherds now, James. Some of y'all know who that is. And long before he was a shepherd, he just was chasing down lost sheep and encouraging them and taking their excuses away from them and all the things you really have to do. And he said, you know what, I'm not a shepherd, but I'm a sheepdog. And he was right. And he's still a sheepdog. Also, he's a shepherd now. But what a valuable help. Other members who can be strong enough to grow, to be helpers like Christ was, interested in souls and taking care of them. So do you see now a mission that's different from just providing a compliant license bureau, come and get your ticket punched for this Lord's Day and go back home with as little inconvenience as possible? Is this a little bit different picture? Do you see a difference from even an organization where we all just come and we do what we love to do and we have the most fun together because we love singing and studying the Bible and all that, but don't disrupt that or I'll get upset. Don't make my life difficult. Is there a difference? And certainly not a business, where people in some ways are on the wrong side of the ledger, and especially troublesome people, but in the church, that is our product. I hope this is clear. Maybe we never had any of those misconceptions, but I think this is the Bible picture. And so, what are we doing? We're protecting children from being tossed to and fro and helping them grow up. And so there you see the real image, and a third image that's clear, and it's clear in the other earlier part of the Ephesians, where he says the whole household of God, or the whole family of God in chapter 3. And by the way, the whole book really begins with the concept of children. Guess what? We're adopted sons. You know that theme from Ephesians 1 and 2? So we'll have an inheritance. That's a family reference. You see, that's ubiquitous in the book as well. And here he's saying, let's treat each other as the way we are, which is all one family or household, if you wanted to use that term as well. So let's try to be a little bit practical. So I'm a shepherd, and I want to do what this says. Do you notice that the green then becomes a kind of cocoon for growing children, right? That is keeping the children from being lost or endangered, but also helping them mature. And if that green that's up there can't get along with themselves, what's going to be the fate of the children? I don't know if you're green, blue, colorblind, but the middle section, right? What will happen to those vulnerable children in the middle? If you can't get along, keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace, what will happen to those children? What do divorces do to children? I don't want to get off on that topic, but y'all know what I mean by this. If the church is not getting along, or is being carnally minded, jealous, all the things that kind of 1 Corinthians mentions, but what's going to happen to this cocoon? So what does an elder do? Well, the first thing I think about is equipping the saints. That's an interesting word. I just learned this recently. I feel academic if I say it. This is hapax legomenon, if y'all know what that means. It means that word, that particular Greek word is not found anywhere else in the New Testament. Now, it's a noun, but the verb is. It doesn't mean handing somebody tools, right? As in 2 Timothy 3, fully equipped to every good work. Y'all probably know that passage. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean handing somebody something. It means arranging things. The same word is used the verb is used to describe mending of nets. Outside the Bible literature, it can mean resetting a bone. Meaning putting those pieces that are like this, like that. Put them back together in the right way. In military terms, it means you stand here You stand right here. You stand right here. You stand right here, and you be ready to do this. Y'all, can you picture that? It's actually arranging people to be ready to do the work. It's not giving them tools necessarily. Can you imagine an elder doing that? Arranging the flock in a way that they're prepared to help this wayward Christian, to enfold this new convert that's just been baptized, to help this couple that's struggling in their relationship with other with some peer modeling. Can you imagine that as the work of a shepherd? Equipping the saints to serve, providing and guiding the builders, edifying, oikodomea, house building. I need to maybe find some builders that I can support who can teach the word. And he even talks about that till we come to the unity of the faith, that's the body of knowledge to be believed, and the knowledge of the Son of God. So we maybe would provide some people who could teach and build up. I would, as an elder, be teaching toward unity in the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God. I might actually be joining and knitting members together. And this is very much in the meaning of that word, knitting together. Perfecting is another translation of that. Is it possible that members need to, and the joints between them need to be encouraged? In some cases, remedied. I'm thinking of Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians. Y'all see what I'm getting at. And these are just samples. I'm not saying that's what the verse is saying, but do you see how this fits in the model? If I'm doing flock shepherding, what I'm actually doing is suiting that green part of the picture so that the blue part can succeed. Does that make sense? I hope it does. And these are examples of choosing men who can grow and help others, of solving problems between relationships, or forming relationships where someone can be a mentor to someone else. These are all, it seems to me, things in that area. Strengthening the joints in the relationships, motivating every part to do its share. I was tempted as an elder. I wouldn't say tempted. I flat out sinned in this. People that didn't cause trouble, you know how much attention they got from me? Yeah. Again, I could make an excuse, there was enough other work going on. Is that the picture here? At a minimum, I should be making sure that every part does its share. Is that important in a house where there's babies or struggles? And so, in some ways you could think, okay, well, elders helping the weak, that's the goal of all of us, really. They're helping the strong who can be builders and healers, but what about those who are kind of in the middle? They're neither, as far as we can tell, they're not struggling, and at the same time, they're not that talented. It seems like that's the rest of the story. How can they do their share? What's a role you can play in welcoming a new member, or helping this couple that's struggling, or helping this older person who's discouraged because their health is failing? You see, there's a role for everybody. It seemed like that the leaders then are working on that cocoon so that the middle part can be successful. And that's the mission of the church, is to grow children up to be to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. I sometimes think about that. The service begins, and I look across, and there's, as Dr. Seuss would say, there's the tall and the small. I don't know, y'all are probably not Dr. Seuss readers, but I'm a granddad, so I'm very familiar. But there's all kind of people. I even see that even tonight. I'm looking across young and older, and probably new Christians and old Christians, and people that are struggling that I don't know for sure, but others that are maybe doing the best they've ever done in their whole life and being Christ-like. I don't know. But when we look across the group, and surely a shepherd, as he looks across the flock that way, he's got to be thinking everyone's a soul with their own story and their own struggles and their own battles and their own potential capabilities that could be put to use in some way. I think that's what flock shepherding actually is. Oh, sure, we do have to have parking spaces, right, and a gift shop and some other things, because those are operational issues. But those should be seen in light of the heart of the shepherd's work, which is helping the body edify itself in love. Okay, and that's no longer children and grow up. All right. So, example. Let's just some thoughts here. If I'm making this flock shepherding decision, you said it was flock shepherding, how would my concern for a weak or immature Christian affect my decision to pick something to study in our Bibles. I'm an elder, right? What are we going to study in the auditorium, right? Now, we have very mature deacons who make excellent recommendations and take the load of the exploration and record keeping off of the elders, but they have a final say. How would it affect your decision to be thinking about weak members? Would it affect what you study in the adult Bible class? Would it? Tell me how. Y'all are all appointed elders for a few minutes here, right? We got to study something in the auditorium, right? That's the way we get our driver's license. I didn't mean to say that. But, we got to have a Bible study. What are we going to study? Yes. Okay. I don't need a specific example, but did you hear her reasoning? She picked the topic because she was thinking about who? People who just come out of the world. Would that fit in the category of children who might be tossed to and fro? So she's thinking about a topic. Now, old brother so-and-so might complain, you know what? This is the 10th time we've studied that topic in the last, 15 years, because he has a record. He's been here that long, right? Wait, who are we picking these topics for, primarily? It might be for the ones who have the biggest need. I'm tired of studying the book of Acts over and over again. I know of a church that's decided every 3 years they're going to go through the book of Acts. Why in the world would they do that? Well, because they're converting people who need to hear that message. And some of the older Christians ought to have their own Bible study habits that didn't somehow stunt their growth because they keep studying Acts over and over again. Y'all know what I mean? Do you see how this would work? How about something like who to hire for a local evangelist or who to have for a gospel meeting? How would that be affected by the weaker members? Would you think of them if you were thinking about having well, we just want a big name preacher so we can get a lot of visitors from all the other churches, right? That's the kind of thing. How would that be affected by worrying about the specific needs of the church? I'm kind of answering the question. I'm making it easier and easier as I keep talking. Is it possible you might have 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 members in mind in particular that need to hear some special topics, and that's how you would pick the preacher? And some of the others who are more mature, they'll get something out of it, but I'm really more worried about the weak Christians. Do you see how that would work? Or we need to work on our unity so that we can help, these weaker Christians. I'm trying to how about the time of worship? We just recently had a change in our time of worship. Would that, even that kind of a silly flock shepherding decision, would that be affected by weaker Christians? Okay, I saw you nod your head. Why did you nod your head this way? Yes. And who would you be thinking about primarily? The people that are going to be here no matter if you meet at midnight or not? No, in some ways. In fact, might it even be more inconvenient for some of the members to accommodate some of those who struggle to get there? Is it possible that we who are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak? I've said that a second time now. Do you understand that that's Christ's likeness? If I'm inconvenienced because it helps someone else who's struggling? That's a privilege. It's not a burden. And you know what? I just have to add this. I think sometimes elders may know more about those situations than most of us do. And when they make a decision, it's not helpful for me to second guess that because I don't like getting up that early, right? Or something, some inconvenience. And I might have some deference because their concern is for weaker Christians. And I like to think of myself as not in that group, but as one who can accommodate those things that might be inconvenient for me, like a baby crying at night. Okay, how do you support this? This is very quick. Shed worldly views of the leaders, please. Let's don't think of that. Don't think of the convenience or the the entertainment value of the worship. Let's think about what our mission is, which is growing up children to be to the measure of the stature of fullness of Christ. Obey and submit. Be submissive. And I think often that sometimes means, well, okay, if they're telling me to do it, I guess the Bible says I have to. No, I think it's more than that. I think there's an endorsement. In the same way that a wife submits to her husband, not by grumbling and finally obeying or something, but finding a way to implement his intentions. What's he trying to do? I can use my own energy and creativity to think of ways to make this work for its purpose, even if it's inconvenient for me, and even if I wouldn't have decided it that way if I were in charge. By the way, when are you actually submitting? It's when you don't agree. So, I mean, in some ways, there's an opportunity there that you might not have otherwise. And don't criticize. There's special protection provided for in 1 Timothy 5, and I think that's a principle that goes back to the Old Testament. When the Israelites were mad about being hungry, or the Egyptians bearing down on them as their backs were to the Red Sea, who did they lash out at? Is Moses. And that was treated about as harshly as any infractions they ever had. And I'm thinking about the earth swallowing up people, or disease passing through the village, the camp, and destroying hundreds of people. Y'all remember those stories. What's the message about murmuring against God's leaders? And I think in any way we want to not do that. And finally, I think you esteem them highly, because you all know that the elders are the smartest people in the church. Y'all are aware of that, aren't you? So you really should look up to them, because they're so brilliant. They never make a mistake. They're so charismatic. They're so creative. They're just brilliant. You know what I mean? They're innovative. They're so organized. Aren't any of those words that I just mentioned in the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 or Titus 1? I'm sorry, none of them are. Why are we esteeming them highly and honoring their decisions and supporting them energetically? Why? It's in yellow. Because of what they're trying to do. Here's a stupid illustration, but I haven't thought of a better one yet. The building is on, I don't know. I guess it's on fire. It's filled with smoke. I don't know where the exits are. And suddenly a man bursts in the back, and he's got a fireman's uniform on, and he says, "You all follow me." And what are you going to do? He's too short to be a fireman. I think his voice is not authoritative enough. He looks awful young. I don't know. Right? Do you understand we would never do that. Why?
You're going to burn.
Yes. His work is kind of important. And whatever he is personally, the fact that he's trying his best to save my life, I esteem him highly. And I'll do what he asked me to do. Can y'all see that? Imperfect illustration. I apologize for that. But I think that's the way we ought to see it. These men are human. They're struggling in many cases with their own, issues, and yet trying to watch in behalf of our souls. Does that not deserve some esteem, some deference? Especially as they are looking to protect children and help us all grow to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Thank you.
If you don't mind, let's stand as we finish tonight. Our Father, we are so thankful for your love, your wisdom that is revealed to us through your word. And Father, help us to submit, because we know that you love us and you know what is best for us. We're thankful for Russ and for Marty and their willingness to come, and even tonight as they've helped us get better. Help us all in our roles, whatever that is in the body, to serve to our fullest capacity. Be with us all tonight, Father. Give us safety. Give us rest for the night, that we may serve you even tomorrow. In Jesus we pray. Amen.